drive from my place in Columbus to my son-in-law's house in Westerville used to take me exactly 22 minutes. I know because I made that drive every single week for almost 3 years. Every Tuesday morning, right after my coffee, I'd fold five $20 bills into an envelope. $100. Sometimes more if I knew things were tight, and I'd make that drive like it was the most natural thing in the world. Because it was. Because that's what you do when your child leaves something behind. My daughter Lydia died on a Thursday in November 2.5 years before any of this happened. Ovarian cancer. She was 34 years old. The doctors caught it late. Stage 3 by the time she finally went in, stage 4 by the time it stopped responding to treatment. She fought for 14 months. I watched every single one of those months eat something out of her until she was a person I almost didn't recognize, but still her, still my Lydia. Right up until the end, she was still cracking jokes and rolling her eyes at the daytime TV they left on in her room. She left behind a daughter. My granddaughter Penny. She was 4 when her mother died. Her father, my son-in-law, a man named Craig. He was devastated, or at least he looked devastated. He and Lydia had been married 6 years, and from everything I could see, he loved her the way a good man loves his wife. He cried at the funeral. He held Penny during the whole service and didn't put her down once. My wife Barbara squeezed my hand and whispered that at least Lydia had found a good one. Barbara passed 8 months after Lydia, heart failure. The doctors said it was unrelated to grief, but I'm a 63-year-old man who has lived long enough to know that the body keeps score of everything the mind pretends to push through. I believe my wife died of a broken heart. I will believe that until the day I die myself. So it was just me and Penny and Craig standing between us. Craig worked in logistics. He managed a distribution warehouse out near the airport. Good steady job, benefits. The kind of work that doesn't make you rich but doesn't leave you desperate either. But Penny was in pre-K and after-school care costs money, and groceries cost money, and Craig had taken 3 weeks off during Lydia's final stretch and burned through most of his savings. I understood all of that. I'd been to it myself decades earlier, scraping by on a mechanic's salary with a wife and 2 kids. I knew what it felt like when the numbers didn't quite add up. So I started bringing an envelope every Tuesday. It was never a formal arrangement. We never sat down and agreed on an amount. The first time I did it, maybe 3 weeks after Lydia's funeral, I just showed up at Craig's door with $100 and said I wanted to help with Penny's school stuff. He tried to refuse. I insisted. He took it. After that, it became a habit. $100 most weeks. Sometimes $150 if I'd had a good month with my retirement distribution. Craig would answer the door. I'd hand him the envelope. I'd sit with Penny for an hour or so, help her with whatever she was doing, read to her, watch cartoons with her, and then I'd drive home. It was the best part of my week. It was honestly the best part of my life for a long time. Penny called me Pop. She had Lydia's eyes. Same shape, same color. That particular shade of green-brown that I used to tease my daughter about. Hazel, she'd say. Dad, it's called Hazel. Penny's hair was darker, like Craig's, but everything else was Lydia. Sometimes sitting across from her at the kitchen table felt like being handed something I thought I'd lost completely. I didn't ask too many questions about Craig's life. He was a private man, always had been, and I respected that. If he was dating again, I didn't want to know. If he was struggling, he'd tell me when he was ready. I figured my job was just to show up, leave the envelope, see Penny, and go home. Keep the connection alive. Keep my granddaughter knowing that her grandfather was there. For 2 years and 3 months. That was exactly how it worked. Then a Tuesday came in late February that changed everything. I stopped at the pharmacy on my way to Craig's. I had been getting my blood pressure medication refilled at the same Walgreens for 11 years, long enough that the pharmacist, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Vic, who'd always remembered my name without looking it up, knew me on sight. I was waiting at the counter while he processed my prescription, half reading a display about flu shots, when he said something that I almost didn't catch. Funny seeing her name come through again. I looked up. "Excuse me." He glanced over his reading glasses at me. "Lydia Harmon, your daughter, right? Her prescription just came through the system yesterday. Refill on a maintenance medication." He must have seen something shift in my face because he slowed down. "I'm sorry I assumed you knew. I probably shouldn't have." "Say that again," I said. My voice came out lower than I intended. You said her prescription. He looked uncomfortable. He closed whatever he'd had open on his screen. I may have spoken out of turn. I apologize. I stood at that counter for a moment, not saying anything. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere in the store, a child was crying. I paid for my medication, got in my car, and sat in the parking lot for a long time. Lydia's prescription. A maintenance medication. The kind they don't fill for dead people. I want to be honest about what I felt in that parking lot because it would be easy to say I was angry or suspicious or that some alarm bell went off in my investigator's brain. But I'm not an investigator. I'm a retired mechanic. What I actually felt was something closer to vertigo, the kind where the ground doesn't feel solid and you're not sure what direction is up. I sat there and I thought about the phone call from Craig 2.5 years ago. I thought about identifying her at the hospital. I thought about the funeral, the casket, the flowers. I thought about the way Craig cried. I drove to his house. I knocked on the door at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning, same as always. No answer. I knocked again. Nothing. I walked around to the side yard. I'd done it 100 times when Penny was playing out back, and I looked through the glass of the back door into the kitchen. The kitchen was clean. Too clean. Not the organized clutter of a man raising a 6-year-old. The kind of clean that means nobody has really been living there. I called Craig's cell. It rang 4 times. I went to voicemail. I sat on his front porch steps for 45 minutes. He didn't come home. I drove back to Columbus and spent the rest of that day doing something I'm not particularly proud of, which is sitting on my couch, pretending that what I was thinking wasn't what I was thinking. I gave it a week. I told myself there was an explanation. Pharmacies make mistakes. Records get mixed up. Maybe it was a different Lydia Harmon. It wasn't an impossible name. Maybe Craig had a reason for not answering the door. Maybe I had the wrong Tuesday. But I went back the following Tuesday, and again there was no answer. I left the envelope in the mailbox, old habit, and drove home. That envelope sat in my mind for the entire drive. $100 in an envelope, dropped into a mailbox, for a house that felt like nobody lived there. I called Craig's sister, a woman named Denise who I'd always gotten along with fine. I told her I'd been trying to reach Craig and asked if everything was okay. She sounded puzzled. She said she hadn't talked to Craig in a couple of months either. She said he'd mentioned something about possibly looking for work in another city, but hadn't given details. "Is Penny with you?" she asked. "No," I said. There was a pause. "Huh," she said. Just that. Huh. That night, I drove back to Westerville at 9:30 in the evening and parked across the street from Craig's house in the dark. The house was completely unlit. I sat there for an hour. At 10:40, a car I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. A woman got out, not young, not old, maybe late 30s, and let herself in with a key. A light came on in what I knew was the kitchen. It went off 20 minutes later. The woman came out, got back in her car, and drove away. I had no idea who she was. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark in my bedroom, the same bedroom where Barbara and I slept for 31 years, and I thought about my granddaughter. I thought about where Penny was. I thought about the last time I'd actually seen her, which I calculated was 6 weeks ago, which was longer than usual, and which Craig had explained away by saying she had a cold and he didn't want me to catch anything. 6 weeks. The next morning, I called a private investigator. I found him through a friend of mine from the shop. My friend had used him for a background check on a contractor years ago and said the man was thorough and discreet. His name was Kellner. I told him what I knew. I told him I needed to find my son-in-law and my granddaughter. I told him I was afraid something wasn't right. He called me back in 4 days. What he told me, I'm going to try to lay out clearly, because it took me several hours to fully absorb it. Craig had not been living in the Westerville house for approximately 6 weeks. He had been renting a property in Clearwater, Florida, a 2-bedroom condo about a mile from the beach, under a slightly different name arrangement, co-signed with a woman named Justine who had been his girlfriend, it appeared, for at least a year. Penny was with him in Florida. She was enrolled in a kindergarten there under her correct name, and Lydia, my daughter, who I watched be lowered into the ground 29 months ago, was also in Florida, living in an apartment in the same complex as Craig and Justine. Not dead. Not even close to dead. Apparently healthy, from what Kellner could observe. She had faked her death. I'm going to take a moment here because I imagine that sentence requires a moment. It certainly did for me. I sat at my kitchen table when Kellner finished talking, and I didn't say a word for so long that he asked if I was still on the line. Yes, I said. Do you want me to keep going? Yes, I said again. What Kellner had pieced together, and he was careful to say this was inference based on records and observation, not certainty, was that Lydia and Craig had staged her death during a genuine hospitalization for a condition that was not cancer. She had been sick, but not terminally. The cancer diagnosis, the prognosis, the 14 months of apparent decline, all of it had been performed for my benefit, for the barber's benefit, for the benefit of anyone who might otherwise be suspicious. The pharmacists slip about the maintenance medication. Kellner thought it was probably for a thyroid condition. Chronic, manageable, the kind of thing you refill on schedule for the rest of your life, and the kind of thing that is apparently very difficult to just stop filling even when you've supposedly died. I want to be very precise about what I knew and didn't know at this point, because I've thought about it a lot since. I don't know exactly why they did it. I've had a lot of time to think through the possibilities. There was the money, obviously, not just what I was bringing every Tuesday, but a life insurance policy that Craig had collected on. There may have been other debts or situations I was never aware of. Lydia and I had not been particularly close in the last few years of her supposed life. There were tensions I never fully understood. But here's what I keep coming back to. They kept Penny. They didn't give her to me, or to Barbara's family, or to Craig's sister Denise. They took her to Florida with them, and put her in kindergarten and let her keep believing she had a father and a mother, a living mother, which means somewhere in Clearwater, Florida, my 6-year-old granddaughter had been watching her mother make breakfast every morning, and had been told, I can only assume, to not talk about Grandpa. Or maybe not to think about Columbus at all. That is the part that is genuinely hard to talk about. I did not call Craig. I did not get on a plane and go to Florida and knock on their door. I did not, despite the many hours I spent imagining it, drive down there and confront my daughter in a parking lot. What I did was call a lawyer. Her name was Prentice. She'd been recommended by a colleague of my son-in-law's divorce attorney, which is a sentence I couldn't have imagined needing to think about a year earlier. I sat in her office on a Wednesday afternoon with Kellner's report and explained the situation. She listened without interrupting. At the end, she said, there are several things happening here simultaneously, and started making a list. There was the life insurance fraud. Craig had collected approximately $185,000 on a policy after providing documentation of Lydia's death. That was federal fraud. Prentice made a separate note about that. There was the matter of my ongoing payments. Over 2 years of weekly envelopes. I'd kept records because I'm the kind of person who keeps records. Over 2 years and 3 months, it amounted to just under $11,000. Prentice said that depending on how a prosecutor wanted to approach it, that was either fraud, theft by deception, or both. And there was Penny. Penny was the reason I hadn't called Craig and screamed at him until my voice gave out. Penny was the reason I was sitting in a lawyer's office instead of driving to Florida. Because if I went down there furious and made a scene, the people who had my granddaughter would know I was coming, and I needed to be very careful about what happened to her. Prentice contacted a family law attorney in Florida who had experience with interstate custody situations. Over the next 3 weeks, while I went about my life as normally as I could manage, these 2 lawyers and Kellner were building a picture. They confirmed Penny's school enrollment. They confirmed Lydia's residence. They confirmed Craig's employment at a logistics company in the Tampa area. They obtained the records that would be needed. I kept making the drive to Westerville on Tuesdays, even though I knew Craig wasn't there. I sat in the parking lot of a diner nearby for a while each time. I don't know why exactly. Routine, maybe. Or just not knowing what else to do with that hour of my week. The day everything came together, I was in Columbus. I got a call from Prentice in the late afternoon. The Florida attorney had coordinated with federal investigators on the insurance fraud. Clearwater PD had made contact with Craig and Lydia that morning. Penny had been with Craig when officers arrived. Craig was taken in for questioning. Lydia was contacted separately. I was on a flight to Tampa the next morning. It was the strangest plane ride I've ever taken. I sat in a window seat and watched Ohio disappear below me and tried to figure out what I was going to feel when I landed. I'd spent so long in the logistical part, the lawyers, the reports, the steps, that I hadn't fully let myself sit with the thing underneath it all, which was that my daughter was alive. My daughter was alive. The family law attorney met me at the airport. We drove together to a DCFS facility where Penny had been placed temporarily while Craig's situation was being processed. I was told Penny had been told that her grandfather was coming to get her. She knew my name. She apparently remembered me. I walked into a room with small plastic chairs and a window that let in flat Florida afternoon light, and my granddaughter ran across the room and crashed into my legs and grabbed on and didn't let go for a long time. She said, "Pop." I sat down on the floor with her right there and just held her. I am 63 years old. I have not cried that hard since Barbara's funeral. I had one conversation with Lydia before everything moved into legal channels. It was brief. It was in a room with her attorney present. She looked exactly like herself, older, a little thinner, but herself. She had Penny's eyes, or Penny had hers. She wouldn't look at me directly for most of it. I asked her one question. I said, "Did you ever think about what it did to your mother?" She didn't answer. I'm not going to tell you that question was strategic or that I said it to achieve something. I asked because I needed to say it out loud in a room where she could hear it. Barbara spent the last 8 months of her life grieving her daughter. I watched her grieve. I watched it take whatever strength she had left, and all of that grief was spent on something that wasn't real. That's the part I can't get around. Not the money, not the fraud. The 8 months my wife spent dying over a lie. The legal proceedings took most of the following year. I won't walk through every detail. Craig cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge on the insurance fraud. The civil matter related to the money I'd given, which was now documented and itemized, was settled. Lydia faced charges related to her role in the fraud. She eventually pleaded to a lesser count. I was granted full custody of Penny. She lives with me now in Columbus. She has her own room, which she has covered in drawings of horses, because she went through a horse phase that shows no sign of ending. She's in first grade. She got a perfect score on her last spelling test and brought it home and held it up in front of my face like evidence of something. And I put it on the refrigerator where Barbara used to put Lydia's school papers 30 years ago. There's a spot on my refrigerator that I've cleared off just for Penny's things. I still drive to Westerville sometimes, not to Craig's house. He's no longer there. I just drive past the area. Old habit. 22 minutes from my front door. I don't know why I keep counting. I think about what I should have asked earlier. I think about all the Tuesdays I showed up at that door and handed over an envelope and told myself I was being a good grandfather, when really I was asking no questions because asking questions hurt too much. I was afraid of the answers. That's the truth of it. Not stupidity. Not naivete. Fear. I was afraid that if I looked too hard at the cracks, I'd find something that would break the only connection I had left to Lydia. Well, the cracks were there. The cracks were the whole story. Here's what I want to say, and I want to say it plainly because I'm not a man who says things with a lot of decoration. If something in your gut is telling you to ask a question, ask it, even if you're afraid of the answer. Especially then, because the answers will come eventually. They always do, and it is far better to face them when you have time to think than to have them arrive in the form of a pharmacist saying your dead daughter's name like it's nothing unusual. Penny asked me last week why Mommy doesn't live with us. I told her that Mommy made some choices that meant she couldn't be with us right now, but that I was here, and that I loved her, and that she was safe. She thought about that for a moment, the way 6-year-olds do, with her whole face, and then she asked if we could have grilled cheese for dinner. We had grilled cheese. I'm not going to pretend I've made my peace with all of it. Some nights I still sit in the kitchen after Penny goes to bed, and the house is very quiet. And I think about Barbara and about Lydia when she was small and about all the roads that somehow led to here. I'm not a man who makes sense of things easily, but I'll tell you this. When Penny got off the school bus last Friday and came running up the driveway with her backpack, bouncing, and she yelled, "Pop!" before she even got to the door, I thought, that's enough. That's more than enough. Protect yourself. Pay attention. Ask the questions that scare you. And don't stop showing up for the people who need you to show up. That's all I know. That's what I've got. I've been thinking a lot lately about the word trust. Not the romantic kind, not the kind you see on greeting cards, the real kind. The quiet, unremarkable kind where you hand someone an envelope every Tuesday morning and drive home without once wondering if you should have asked a question first. I trusted Craig because Lydia chose him. I trusted Lydia because she was my daughter. I trusted the grief itself, the funeral, the casket, the whole awful machinery of loss, because I didn't have the emotional strength left to question any of it. I had just lost Barbara. I was running on fumes, and people in that condition don't investigate. They survive. They show up with envelopes and they hold their granddaughters and they tell themselves that this small ritual is enough. But here's what I've learned, and I don't say it lightly. Trust that goes unexamined isn't really trust. It's avoidance wearing trust's clothing. I wasn't trusting Craig and Lydia. I was protecting myself from the possibility that they weren't who I needed them to be. Those are two very different things. And the difference cost me 2 years, $11,000, and every single one of the 8 months my wife spent grieving a daughter who was alive and well in Florida. That's the cause and effect of it. Stripped down plain. I chose comfort over clarity, and clarity found me anyway, through a pharmacist who said a dead woman's name like it was nothing unusual. The truth didn't disappear because I wasn't looking for it. It just waited. It waited until the cost of finding it was higher than it needed to be. I'm not saying this to punish myself. I've done enough of that in the kitchen at night after Penny goes to bed. I'm saying it because I think a lot of people are carrying envelopes to doors they've stopped really looking at, out of love, out of exhaustion, out of fear. And fear is the thing I want to talk about, because fear is what this really was. Not stupidity, not weakness, fear. I was afraid that if I looked too closely, I'd lose the last thread connecting me to my daughter. What I understand now is that the thread was already gone. What I was holding on to wasn't Lydia, it was the idea of her. A performance of grief and need that was designed specifically to keep me from looking up. Courage, in my experience, doesn't feel like courage when you're in it. It feels like asking one uncomfortable question when every instinct tells you not to. It feels like calling a lawyer instead of pretending the house just seemed a little too clean. It feels like walking into a room in Florida and sitting down on the floor and holding a 6-year-old who calls you Pop, and deciding that whatever comes next, you are going to face it with your eyes open. Penny got 100 on her spelling test last week. She held it up in front of my face like it was the most important document ever produced in the history of the world. Maybe it is. I put it on the refrigerator, right next to where Barbara used to put Lydia's. That's where we are. That's what I've got, eyes open from here.